Now, I want to conclude today, and I've got 2.5 minutes. I want to conclude today by sharing a personal story with you that I hope will drive home this idea of reading a magazine that you've never read before. Now, this is a story about my parents, which is sometimes difficult for me to tell because they're no longer with us. And while it's ultimately a story about my dad, it's really a story about my mom, and I need to give you some background. My mother was a voracious reader. Any spare minute she had her nose stuck in a book. But the odd thing was she wouldn't read fiction. I remember coming home from high school once and telling her about a novel that was so good that she ought to read it. And she looked at me, she goes, no, I don't read fiction. I only read nonfiction. Give me something good for my mind. She actually said that. Now, who says that? I thought that was really weird. But years later, when I became an adult, I learned why. You see, my mother was born during the Depression to a blue-collar family. Now, neither one of her parents went beyond 8th grade in their education, and she wasn't really encouraged to go too far with her education because you're just going to get married. But she did. She finished high school, and she went 1 year to college to become an X-ray technician. Then she met my dad and married into a family of professionals, a family of doctors, lawyers, accountants, engineers, and a mother-in-law who didn't mind letting my mother know she thought Dad married a little too far down the social ladder. Yeah, my grandma. Well, my mother wanted to be accepted by her new family, but she found that that education deficit made a difference. She couldn't keep up with a lot of conversations that were going on at the family dinners, and she was determined to close that gap, so that's when she started reading as much as she could so that she could get rid of that education deficit she had. That's the background. Here's the story. Around 1960 or 61, my father was diagnosed with kidney failure. Now, I was a toddler at the time, 3, 4 years old. All I remember is that my strong daddy could no longer pick me up and carry me anymore. I noticed he didn't go to work as often as he used to, that he would lay in bed all day or have to lay on the sofa. I also noticed that my mother took over most of the driving, and that occasionally she had to pull off on the side of the road so that he could throw up. Those are my memories as a toddler. What I didn't know is what the doctor told my father. Mr. Wilson, you have kidney failure. There is no cure. You have less than a year to live. You need to make your plans. And so they did. First thing they did was they sold the house. And my father, who was a builder, took the proceeds from that and built a 3-unit apartment house with the idea that my mother, my sister, and I could live in 1 unit and live partially off the rents of the other 2. Now, my mother was a stay-home mom, and she had not worked in years. The goal was that when that inevitable day came, she would go to work part-time at first, and then when my sister and I started school, she'd go to work full-time then. In the meantime, she started taking some temp jobs in order to beef up her skills and to develop a network to help her find that permanent job when the time came. And then something interesting happened at one of those temp jobs. There was 2 hours of downtime. I don't know if it was an unreliable X-ray machine or some other reason that she had 2 hours to kill. So she went into the doctor's office lobby and she went to the magazine rack. She scanned over the popular titles of the day and then noticed on the bottom shelf a several months out of date copy of the New England Journal of Medicine. And she goes, I'll read that. It'll be good for my mind. And she sat down and started to read. After a few minutes, she realized she was reading an article about some physicians in Boston who were doing some experimental surgery. The surgery they were doing was the world's first organ transplants. And as she read on, she learned that the organ they were transplanting was the kidney. Now, she got pretty excited at this point and started reading more intently. And as she read on, she learned that those doctors were looking for volunteers, at least when the magazine came out. But there was a catch. The volunteers had to have an identical twin. My father happened to have an identical twin. And at that point, my mother abandoned the magazine and went right to the phone. And she started dialing Boston until she got one of those physicians on the phone. And when she did, the doctor said, yes, Mrs. Wilson, we are still looking for volunteers. Please send me your husband and his brother. So that night, my mother and my father went to visit my uncle. And his answer, to save your life, Absolutely, you can have a kidney. And I tell you this story because if my mother had not had a lifelong habit of exposing herself to new things, my father would never have become the 12th person in the world to have a kidney transplant and live. And I wouldn't have gotten my dad for 18 more years. You see, when you begin to think like an innovator, when you begin to embrace the innovator's lifestyle, you will recognize opportunities and trends that others will not. You will solve problems faster and easier than ever before. You will handle change like a boss. I want to thank you for having me here today. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you.